Every summer, gardeners reach for the same bottle, spray it on, hope for the best, and wonder why the bugs come back anyway. But 200 years ago, farm families didn't have that bottle, and their gardens still survived. Not because pests didn't exist, because they understood something we've mostly forgotten. You don't have to kill every insect. You just have to make your garden the wrong place for them to be. That single idea shaped how an entire nation grew its food for generations, and most of it cost nothing but a little time. For a farm family in the 18 and 1900s, a garden wasn't a hobby, it was survival. Whatever grew between spring and fall had to carry a household through a long, hard winter. Root vegetables in the cellar, dried beans in the pantry, preserved fruit on the shelf. If pests destroyed a significant part of that harvest, there was no quick trip to the store to make up the difference. There was no backup plan. That reality forced a different relationship with pest control than the one most of us have today. There was no bottle to reach for. No synthetic pesticide had been invented yet, and even if it had, most rural households couldn't have afforded it regularly. So whatever method a family used had to meet three hard requirements. It had to work reliably, season after season. It had to be cheap enough to repeat constantly, because a garden needed protecting from the first seedling to the last harvest. And it had to use only what was already on hand, because running to town for supplies wasn't always practical, and money was tight. Those constraints didn't produce weak solutions. They produced smart ones. When you can't afford to fail and you can't afford to spend, you're forced to actually understand the problem instead of just reacting to it. And that's exactly what happened. Here's the thing. We're not as far removed from that problem as we like to think. Commercial pesticides today are expensive, and the cost adds up fast if you're treating a real vegetable garden every week or two through a full growing season. A lot of gardeners are also uneasy about spraying chemicals near food they're about to eat, especially with kids or pets running through the yard. And even when a spray works, it's rarely a one-time fix. You're buying it, applying it, and buying it again. That's part of why interest in natural pest control has been quietly climbing, not because it's trendy, but because the underlying problem hasn't actually changed. People still want a garden that survives the season without spending a fortune or spraying something they don't feel great about. And it turns out, the answer to that problem was already worked out a long time ago. We just stopped using it. This wasn't some ancient secret passed down through one particular group or written in a single old book somewhere. Rural households across very different regions of the country, different climates, different crops, different circumstances, independently arrived at overlapping solutions. That's worth sitting with for a second. When people in completely separate places, without communicating with each other, keep landing on the same basic techniques, it's usually because those techniques actually work. This knowledge came from decades, sometimes generations, of watching a garden closely, noticing which plants seem to struggle less when grown near certain others, noticing that a dusting of ash around the base of a plant seemed to keep certain crawling insects away, noticing that planting the same vulnerable crop in the same row year after year seemed to invite more trouble each time. None of it came from a lab. It came from paying attention, season after season, and passing along what worked to the next generation.
That's the kind of knowledge that's easy to lose because it was never written down as a formal system. It just lived in practice, in habit, in the way people gardened without even thinking about why. So what did that practice actually look like? Historically, it came down to three core approaches, used together rather than on their own. The first was companion planting, deliberately growing certain plants next to each other, not for looks, but for protection. Marigolds planted among vegetables, aromatic herbs like basil or mint tucked along the edges of a row. These weren't decorative choices, they were functional ones, chosen because certain plants seemed to make the whole row less appealing to common pests, or more appealing to the insects that actually help a garden. The second was the use of simple barrier substances, wood ash, saved from the household fire, dusted around the base of vulnerable plants. Later, as it became available, diatomaceous earth, a fine natural powder, used the same way. Neither of these were poisons. They worked as a physical barrier that crawling insects didn't want to cross. And the third was what you might call physical interruption, hand removing larger pests directly off the plant, using cedar shavings, which many insects avoid, around storage areas and garden beds, and critically rotating which crops were planted where from one season to the next, so pests that targeted a specific plant couldn't simply settle in and multiply undisturbed year after year. 3 approaches, none of them complicated, all of them still available to any gardener today. Now, it's worth actually understanding why these methods worked instead of just repeating them as tradition, because once you understand the mechanism, you understand how to use them properly. Companion planting works largely through scent. Many garden pests find their target plants by smell. Strong scented herbs and flowers planted nearby can mask that scent, making it harder for pests to locate the vegetables they're after. Some companion plants go a step further and actively attract beneficial insects, the kind that prey on common garden pests, which adds a layer of natural defense on top of the scent masking. It's not magic, it's simply making the garden harder to navigate for the insects you don't want, while inviting in a few that help. Wood ash and diatomaceous earth work through a completely different, very physical mechanism. Both substances are mildly abrasive at a microscopic level. When a soft-bodied, crawling insect moves across them, the powder damages its outer protective layer, which causes it to dry out. It's not poisoning the insect. It's simply an environment that crawling pests want to avoid crossing. That's why reapplication matters. Rain or heavy watering washes the barrier away, and once it's gone, the protection is gone with it, and crop rotation interrupts something pests depend on completely, the availability of their target crop in the same place every single year. Many pests overwinter in the soil near where their host plant grew. If that same vulnerable crop isn't there the next season, the pest population that was counting on it has nothing to return to. It's a slow method. It doesn't solve a problem this week, but over several seasons, it steadily reduces pest pressure in a way that spraying never really does, because spraying treats the symptom while rotation removes the cause. So how did a household actually put this into practice across a growing season? It followed a fairly consistent rhythm. It started before a single seed went into the ground, with planning, deciding which companion plants would go where. Marigolds worked into vegetable rows, aromatic herbs along the borders, mapped out alongside the main crops rather than added as an afterthought.
Once plants were established, ash or diatomaceous earth would be applied around the base of the most vulnerable plants, the ones that experience had shown were frequent targets. This wasn't a one-time treatment. It was reapplied regularly, and always after rain or a thorough watering, because the barrier only works while it's actually there. Early morning was the time for inspection. Many common garden pests are most active and most visible in the cool of early morning, before the day heats up. A quick walk through the rows, checking the undersides of leaves where insects and eggs tend to hide, caught problems while they were still small and manageable. When a larger pest was spotted, something too big for the barrier method to handle, it was simply removed by hand, dropped into a container of soapy water or similar, and dealt with directly. No spraying required for an isolated problem. And at the end of the season, the plan for next year was already forming. Which crops had struggled with pests this year, and where they'd be moved to next season, so the same trouble didn't simply return to the same row. This rotation, repeated year after year, is what turned a single season's effort into a garden that got progressively easier to protect over time. The opposite of what happens when you rely on spraying alone, where you're fighting the same battle every single year with no cumulative benefit. Now, this system does have failure points, and it's worth knowing them, because they're the same mistakes that trip people up today when they try these methods for the first time. The most common one is relying on a single method alone and expecting it to do everything. Companion planting helps, but it's not a complete defense on its own. The old approach worked because these 3 methods were layered together, each covering a gap the others left open. The second mistake is timing the barrier applications poorly. Putting ash or diatomaceous earth down right before rain, only to have it washed away within hours, then wondering why pests came right back. The powder needs to go down when the soil is dry, and it needs to be checked and reapplied after any significant rain or watering. The third is waiting too long, letting a small pest problem sit unaddressed because it doesn't look serious yet. Early morning inspection existed specifically to catch problems, while hand removal was still enough to solve them, before they became large enough to threaten the whole row. And the fourth is skipping rotation because it feels unnecessary in the moment. Planting the same vulnerable crop in the same spot because it's convenient, and slowly watching pest pressure build there year after year until it becomes a real problem that's much harder to reverse. So how does this actually compare to reaching for a commercial pesticide today? It's worth being fair to both sides here. A synthetic pesticide can act faster in a genuine emergency. If a pest population has already exploded, a spray can knock it back in a way that ash or companion planting simply can't do overnight. That's a real advantage in certain situations. But for the everyday, ongoing task of keeping a home vegetable garden healthy through a season, the old approach has real strengths that are easy to overlook. It costs close to nothing to maintain. Ash comes from a fireplace. Diatomaceous earth is inexpensive at a garden supply store, and companion planting seeds cost the same as any other seeds. It doesn't require repeated purchases throughout the season. And for a lot of people, there's real value in not having synthetic chemical residue on food that's about to be eaten, especially in a garden that children or pets have access to. This isn't a case for abandoning modern pest control entirely, especially for larger-scale agriculture facing pressures a backyard garden never will. But for the home gardener specifically, the old methods were never actually replaced because they stopped working. They were replaced because something faster came along and got marketed harder. The underlying logic never went away. Here's what I want you to take from this. This isn't nostalgia. This isn't just an interesting piece of history to file away. These are methods you can put to use in your own backyard garden starting this week, and they still work exactly the way they worked 200 years ago for exactly the same reasons. Plant a few marigolds among your vegetables. Keep a small container of wood ash or diatomaceous earth on hand and dust it around the base of the plants that tend to get hit hardest. Walk your garden in the early morning instead of the middle of the afternoon, and next season, move things around instead of planting the same crop in the same spot out of habit. None of it is complicated. None of it costs much, and all of it is built on reasoning that farm families arrived at the hard way, through necessity, through trial and error, through paying close attention to a garden they genuinely couldn't afford to lose. For most of American history, this wasn't considered special knowledge. It was just how you kept a garden. Every household knew it, because every household depended on it. Somewhere along the way, between convenience and marketing, most of us stopped passing it down. But the garden hasn't changed. The pests haven't changed. And it turns out neither has the solution. If you try even one of these methods this season, you're not doing something new. You're doing something your grandparents or their grandparents already knew worked. If you found this useful, there's more forgotten practical knowledge like this coming. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.